Hello everyone, this is Darion of GNB Productions, and today we're going to be taking a look at Batman Caped Crusader. Batman Caped Crusader is a new Batman animated series on Amazon Prime and released in August of 2024. The series centers around the first 2 weeks of the Batman's Caped Crusade, and sees him protecting the streets of 1940s Gotham from the likes of criminal gangs, costumed criminals, and paranormal and supernatural entities. If there's a word to describe Caped Crusader, it'd be solid. Like, this is just a solid-ass show. It really feels like it just came and went, which is a shame because this show does some pretty interesting stuff with its world and characterization of its cast. That might be due to the limited marketing run as well as them dropping all the episodes in one day. But regardless, even though I don't think the show is spectacular or anything, it's a shame a lot of people haven't given it much thought. The story is primarily episodic, dealing with a new villain and situation every episode for Batman to deal with, but with little sprinkles of an ongoing narrative spread throughout. I think the show did this incredibly well because it provides a pretty nostalgic feel in having episode-to-episode conflicts that seemingly doesn't relate much to each other that much, but also has a pretty interesting narrative revolving around the inner workings and corruption of Gotham, and I found it pretty interesting. The tone was expertly handled as well, I feel. With trying to keep the comparisons to a minimum, as I'll get into in just a sec, this show really does feel like a good spiritual successor to the original Batman the Animated Series, in the sense of the tone, vibe, and general feel being quite consistent between the two. The very eerie and gothic feel is handled brilliantly, and it fits really well with the Batman character, for obvious reasons. But considering how Bruce Timm, before the show dropped, described this as being a more mature version of the original animated series, I was a little disappointed to see how kinda tame it was. Now, I didn't need to see limbs flying and endless gore and swears or anything like that, but this really just feels like a standard animated series that kids could very easily enjoy. Now, in comparison to the old animated series, it is a tad more grim and dark, but never to a point where it feels like an elevation of the old series' tone. The world building for this show is also interesting. When I heard that Matt Reeves was attached in the producing role for this show, I initially expected a more grounded, noir, detective-driven narrative that didn't really dip its toes into the wider, more fantastical DC universe, but I was pleasantly surprised that the show managed to kind of balance both of these elements in interesting ways. The show still feels relatively down-to-earth, with the main narrative revolving around the corruption and warped politics of Gotham City, but they still manage to slip in a thing or two with ghosts and vampires, as I'll get into in just a bit, but it's never to a point where it feels distracting or out of place in the world that's being built here, and I like how they managed to do that. There are a few outliers. One or two notable Batman characters, like Killer Croc for example, have been simplified to just being a dude with a skin condition. In general stuff like that, which shows a more down-to-earth take on some characters. The world building isn't perfect, however. As I mentioned in the summary, this show takes place in 1940s Gotham, but some of the time it really doesn't feel that way. I remember before the show released, there was a big discussion on how certain characters were depicted and how that would translate into the show's world, being that it takes place in the 40s. Notably, Jim Gordon being a black man in this show, as well as being the police commissioner, and his daughter Barbara Gordon, a black woman, being a lawyer. Naturally, at least to me, you'd expect there to be some sort of conflict amongst the characters in the show, given how these two have such big jobs within the legal system, and of course being black and all. But stuff like that never gets called attention to, almost as if it doesn't matter. On top of that, Harleen Quinzel openly asks Renee Montoya out on a date, even sharing a kiss on said date, and again, it's not treated as something taboo. Like, it really doesn't matter. And on one hand, I like how natural this stuff feels, but at the same time, if you're going to go out of your way to set your story in the 40s, I'd at the very least expect this kind of stuff to kind of reflect what the 40s was like back then, you know? Because surely people of color working in the police department and same-sex couples wouldn't have gotten at least a little bit of fucking scrutiny back then. But then again, if they did call attention to this stuff, you'd have folks crying about how the show's woke or whatever. But fuck them, man, who cares? They're already doing it anyway, so just go all in. It would have been a bit more interesting, at least to me. It's not even just stuff like that. The whole show, I don't really think makes good use of the 40s setting. Nothing about how the show presents itself really gives you that much of an indication that this is in the 1940s. Besides the dated technology, I unironically believe you could tell someone this show takes place in the 70s or 80s, and not many would bat an eye. I need to preface that this stuff doesn't make the show bad or worse or anything like that. I just feel like they could have done more with the show being set in the 40s, rather than just relying on an overall aesthetic. The character work in this show is pretty damn good. They get real experimental with a lot of the characters in ways that I think are very welcome. We get really unique interpretations that play off of their core characteristics, but twist them a bit to make them feel more distinctive. The way the show depicts Bruce Wayne really intrigued me. Firstly, the show did a great job writing in and establishing the contrast between the Bruce Wayne and Batman identities. There are so many funny and unintentionally funny moments where Bruce switches between them almost seamlessly. But he does have a pretty decent arc throughout the show as well. For the most part, it really is just the standard Batman needs to learn to trust people and let them in and whatnot. But this show went out of its way to dive in a tad deeper to Bruce's psyche, which I found interesting. Even having the dude go to therapy and having Harleen Quinzel be his psychiatrist, funnily enough. And I especially love how that's a minor through line within the show, is Batman routinely having to go to therapy, and it's especially neat how it attributes to his growth. They as well went out and made Bruce a bit more jaded and colder in his demeanor and treatment of others. Far more than any other interpretation, I think. And I feel like that's what made his arc come off a bit stronger. The biggest example of this being his relationship with Alfred. This is probably the worst Batman has treated Alfred in any piece of Batman media, because there really isn't any familial connection or history between the two, and Bruce just sees him as a partner in his war on crime and nothing more. The dude doesn't even call him Alfred for 99% of the series, he just calls him Pennyworth. I've seen people hate on this aspect of the relationship for understandable reasons. This isn't how most would like the dynamic to be depicted. And even when watching it, I couldn't help but just feel horrible for Alfred given how much he tries with Bruce. But especially for the story they were trying to tell with Bruce here, I think it works extremely well, especially when seeing how much Bruce grew by the end of the season. As far as the other characters, I think Alfred was fantastic. He's a sweet, caring old dude, but still has some of that trademark sass from time to time. Kudos to him for dealing with Bruce's crazy ass for all these years, because I promise you, if this kid popped up in my room in the middle of the night talking about making people pay and whatnot, I promise you, his little ass would have got it punted out of a window like a goddamn soccer ball. As far as the folks at the GCPD, I think they're fine. Gordon is okay in this series. He shows a lot of stubbornness in his ideologies, and it's neat seeing the kind of clash with characters like Barbara. But other than that, I think his overall character could have been handled a bit better. Barbara, however, was great, I feel. Making her a lawyer was a really neat choice and really allowed for the show to flesh out who she really wants to be. Having her work alongside her dad, and seeing how much she tries to fight for what many see as a failed and corrupt city, was really commendable. I even especially loved the partnership her and Batman formed. It was really cool. I thought Renee Montoya was also pretty good. Something often at the heart of Batman media are of course the villains. To start off small, I like what they did with Flash and Bullock this season. Being two mischievous and crooked cops, it was neat seeing the lengths they'd go to in order to achieve the goals they had set out, and just seeing how much worse and worse they could get. I have my nitpicks, as I do wish Bullock maybe had a bit more nuance with his character. Given how he's more often depicted as, while being hard-edged, still very much set out to do good. But again, that's just a nitpick, as he works for this particular world and story. But our overarching villain for this season, and presumably season 2, is surprisingly down to earth, being none other than crime boss Rupert Thorne. Thorne I thought was a serviceable villain for this season, mainly due to how he contributes to Harvey Dent's story, which I'll get into in just a bit. But I really only became invested in Thorne by the end, where all the characters try to work closer within the law, and it just seems near impossible to really get this guy. In this season, he was fine, nothing too interesting, but I'm really looking forward to how they might continue this story in the next season. Now for the big ones. Like I said, this show follows a very episodic formula, with establishing and dealing with a new villain each episode. To go in order, we get introduced to this show's take on the Penguin, a gender-bent version named Oswalda Cobblepot. I think Penguin was fine in this show. Making her a mother was only really interesting when showing her cold-blooded and ruthlessness. Otherwise, she was just fine. She was also fine in a few other ways. Catch my drift. Next up, we have Clayface, who was a lot more like his classic depiction in the comics. Instead of being a hulking clay monster, we have a dude that can manipulate his form with this weird experimental clay. I thought this was really cool as it fits the slightly grounded angle this show is going for, and the episode itself made great use of it with building up the whole mystery and such. After him, we're introduced to Catwoman, who has a pretty fun personality and dynamic with Batman. Not the best depiction of these two, but seeing how her whole persona is inspired off of him was really neat. Her rambunctious nature was really fun to see and explore, and seeing stuff like the Catmobile was also really cool. I almost don't want to count this next one as he's not really the villain for the episode, Bullock and Flass are, but up next we have Firebug, who's really just a disturbed Arkham inmate who wants to spread the joy of his flames with everyone he meets. He was fine for this particular episode and story, but nothing really memorable. After him, we have none other than Harley Quinn, who I think may be the best villain introduced in this show. Like I said, this show really likes to switch things up when it comes to its depiction of these characters, and I think Harley may be my favorite when it comes to that. Instead of being a psychiatrist who falls in love with the Joker, she's instead a psychiatrist who aims to punish and torture the corrupt and wealthy elite of Gotham City. This is something I really didn't expect, but wound up absolutely loving. I like how she's not really a villain per se, and just tries to enact her own sense of justice on those she deems worthy of it. Not to mention, I like the switch up they made in having Harleen Quinzel be more fun, lively, and spontaneous, while the Harley Quinn persona is much more serious and intimidating. Harley in this show was really fun, and I especially love how she was a recurring character before this reveal. Gentleman Ghost I really dug for being the first villain to throw us into the supernatural aspects of this universe. I love how, due to the villains being up to this point relatively down to earth, both Batman and the audience to a certain extent are skeptical of this reverse Robin Hood-like ghost dude, thinking that there's some realistic angle and explanation at play here, before quickly confirming that no, this is a real fucking ghost. I like how they managed to execute that, and afterwards they went all in on figuring out how to deal with this ghost dude, and it was honestly really fun. Up next we have Onomatopoeia. He and Gentleman Ghost have something in common, which I like. It's that, yeah, not only do they branch out the universe, but their presence alludes to those like Constantine and Green Arrow being present in this world, which I found to be pretty neat. Anyway, Onomatopoeia was fine in this show. I was introduced to this character through Superman and Lois, so maybe they spoiled me a bit, but I think it would have been more interesting for Onomatopoeia to have had some kind of metahuman ability, not to the lengths of what they did in Superman and Lois, but instead of it just being a guy speaking in onomatopoeias, actually have him be able to make these sounds. The reason I would have preferred this is because A, it would have been cooler, and B, it would have made the climax taking place in an old abandoned construction yard way more interesting. Having him distract or disorient Batman with these various different sounds he can make. But whatever. As it stands, Pia was fine in this show. It was definitely funny to have a dude just talking onomatopoeias, despite the missed potential in my opinion. Up next is Nocturna, a character who before watching this show I didn't even know existed, but loved her inclusion in this episode. Being a vampire who feasts off of people's souls was really cool, and seeing Batman go up against another paranormal foe was really interesting. Her story in this episode in particular is quite tragic, as she never chose for her existence to be like this, and after killing her brother, she wishes for Batman to just end it all for her. But of course, Batman being Batman, he chooses not to do this. This particular episode was also really neat, as we get a few cute Easter eggs and references to other Batman-related characters. Notably many of the Robins, like Dick, Jason, Stephanie, Carrie, all being kids in this orphanage. Not even just them, but none other than Killer Croc, who I mentioned earlier, being a part of a group of circus freaks who mistakes Bruce for being a pedophile when he's searching for the kids Nocturna kidnapped. Yes, I'm being serious.
Have you seen two girls around here? One has a blonde ponytail, the other...
Why are you looking for two little girls?
No, wait! Damn creep.
Well, Bruce, if it ain't kid diddling they'll get you for, it'll at the very least be child endangerment. Do you know how many kids this motherfucker adopts specifically to fight crime? A lot of which being in this show, funnily enough. And last but certainly not least, Harvey Dent. Harvey, to me, at least for a while, has kind of felt like a one-trick pony kind of villain. A lot of his intrigue in regards to his character is seeing his descent into becoming Two-Face, with not many interesting things being done with him. This is mainly me talking about the stuff outside of comics. Maybe there's some stuff y'all can point me to that I haven't seen yet. But this show cleverly works around that problem for me. Firstly, Harvey throughout this show has been skirting the line between good and bad, being at conflict with himself and doing whatever it takes to win his mayoral campaign, even going as far as to work with Rupert Thorne, but still tried to do what's best for the city of Gotham, and it's probably one of the best depictions of Harvey's story, because we rarely see him in a light like this, and it's nice to see a bit more duality and nuance added to his character. And it gets even better after he becomes Two-Face, because he doesn't go full bad guy. He goes after the criminals who did this to him, and after he comes to his senses, he actively works with the Gordons, Batman, and Montoya to try and bring Thorne to proper justice. It's a shame how his efforts would immediately be in vain, making another tragic end to the Harvey Dent character. I genuinely hope future interpretations learn from this show's depiction of Dent, to play more into that duality instead of just making him a straight bad guy after the accident. Not to say that's bad, but I'd like to see more stuff like this. The character writing as a whole for this season is really solid. The shakeups to the villains are really cool, seeing how much corruption plagues these various characters is interesting, and seeing how Batman over the course of the show learns to let go of the darkness that plagued him for so long was also really compelling. And while it isn't a major thing, I like how they show the guilt and remorse Alfred has over the Wayne's deaths. Just some good stuff all around. The voice acting in this show is also just as great. Hamish Linklater was absolutely fantastic as Batman. A good litmus test for how good a Batman voice is, at least to me, is how different they make Batman and Bruce Wayne sound. The late Kevin Conroy is synonymous for pulling this off with his Batman performances, and Linklater I think is right under Conroy when it comes to pulling this off effectively. And I think this show does a great job at showing it because, like I mentioned a bit ago, there are several scenes where Bruce will put on the Batman voice while out of costume, and it's really cool at how seamless the switch is sometimes.
Thanks for the offer, Doc, but I'm all aces now. I promise. So, can I get you to sign these, then? Make sure Lucius Fox gets these.
Your final session, was it?
Yes, thankfully.
Now, when talking about his overall performance and not just going over the whole Bruce and Batman dichotomy, his take on Batman is just good. Not some of the best, as I've heard better Batman voices, but he works really well for this show. He has this very low and almost whispery tone, which is fine, but to me, not on the line of folks like Conroy or even Roger Craig Smith. As a whole, though, Linklater was pretty solid, I feel. Another standout performance next to him is none other than Diedrich Bader as Harvey Dent, who does an incredible job at portraying Harvey as this almost suave asshole, but really shines when showing the twisted nature of Two-Face. There are actually quite a few staple voices from previous Batman media here, with the likes of Tom Kenny as E.L. O'Brien and Firebug, and even Roger Craig Smith as Jim Corrigan, and even John DiMaggio as Harvey Bullock, all of which did a great job. Crystal Joy Brown was really good as Barbara. She didn't have many big standout moments for me, but I still really dug her performance. Jason Watkins as well did a decent job with Alfred, I feel. But other big standouts include Jamie Chung as Harley Quinn, and fucking Christina Ricci as Catwoman. Jamie was so fun as Harley, and really delivered on that cold and chilling front whenever she fully envelops the persona. Ricci as well was really fun as Selina Kyle in this show. She has the smooth and mischievousness that is expected with the character, but she also really gets to flex her comedic edge as Selina is pretty damn funny in a few of her appearances. All around, the voice cast was amazing in this show. Now, easily, the most debatable thing in regards to this show, at least to me, would be the animation and art style. The art style for Caped Crusader is fine. Or, well, I guess I should say basic. Like, it ain't bad, but it ain't really that good either. It's funny how two animated superhero shows released on Amazon Prime, being this show and Invincible, both have a problem when it comes to lackluster animation. Again, I gotta stress, it's not bad, but man is it lacking. A lot of the characters' movements are pretty stiff, the action scenes lack a lot of fluidity. There are a handful of smoothly animated scenes, but they're pretty far and few between, and none of them really come nearly as close to the stuff that Batman the Animated Series pulled off decades ago. And I know I said I'd try to keep comparisons to a minimum, but I'm mainly bringing it up now because the fact that an animated series in 2024 can't quite match up to one of its predecessors from the 90s is quite sad. It's especially disappointing because I don't know about y'all, but when they revealed the poster for this show like 2 or 3 years ago, and it had Batman looking straight like out of those 40s comics, I was hoping for a very stylized take on that whole look and aesthetic from back then. And what we got here wasn't bad, but just alright. Overall, Batman Caped Crusader is a fairly decent show, with really well-written characters, a plot and world that is engaging episode to episode. Mixing in weird and fantastical elements with a more grounded, long-running narrative was done very effectively. This take on Batman and Gotham were really fun and interesting. topped off with some outstanding voice work, but is held back just a tad with pretty shoddy world building. Them not really taking advantage of the 40s setting is very noticeable in a lot of aspects, and the show's pretty mediocre animation and art style doesn't help much either. But as a whole, I'd say Caped Crusader is still very much worth the watch, and I can't wait to see what they do in Season 2. So, with all that said, if you agree or disagree with anything I've said in this video, let me know right down there in the comments below. Also be sure to like and subscribe. This is Darion of GNB Productions, and take care.